I had been in Abu Dhabi for just 3 weeks when I first saw him. The city was still a blur of contrasts to me, glass towers rising out of sand, the call to prayer drifting like a song through traffic and sea breeze, evenings painted with the smell of oud and cardamom. I was there on a teaching contract, hired to tutor English to the younger cousins of a prominent family. I didn't expect to meet him, the Sheikh. It was at dusk in the family courtyard, the kind of evening when the air finally let go of the day's suffocating heat. Lanterns swung gently in the breeze. Date palms rustled like whispers. People moved respectfully, servants carrying trays, relatives greeting one another. And then he appeared. He walked slowly, not out of hesitation but command. His robe brushed against the marble with a soft sweep, the fabric catching the lantern light. Heads turned subtly, nods of acknowledgement followed his path. His presence filled the courtyard without effort. I had heard his name spoken with reverence, sometimes even fear. A man tied to generations of lineage, wealth, tradition. A man whose decisions carried weight beyond his own household. I had imagined someone untouchable, stern, distant. But when his eyes found mine, I forgot every rumor. His gaze was steady, not searching, not casual. It landed on me like the desert sun, warm, unrelenting, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, the noise of the courtyard fell away. I should have looked down like the others. Instead, I froze. My chest tightened. And in his expression, I saw something I hadn't expected. Something that didn't fit the image of the powerful Sheikh. It was recognition. As if he saw through me or perhaps saw with me. A flicker of loneliness? Maybe curiosity. Maybe something he would never speak aloud. That night, the family hosted a dinner beneath the stars. A long table stretched across the garden, lanterns glowing above it like suspended fireflies. He sat at the head, his posture calm, his every gesture precise. I sat far down the table, tucked among tutors and cousins, unnoticed by most. But not by him. More than once, I felt his eyes brush against me. Not openly, not carelessly, quietly, almost secretively, as though checking if I was still there. Every time it happened, my pulse quickened, my fork hovered midair, and I had to remind myself to breathe. When conversation lulled, he surprised me by speaking directly across the table. His voice was low, smooth, deliberate. "Where is home for you?" The question struck deeper than it should have. My throat went dry as all eyes turned briefly toward me. "England," I managed. "A small town outside of Bristol." He nodded once. "And it was easy leaving your family behind?" The question pierced through the polite surface. I hesitated. Lying would have been easier, but his gaze told me he wasn't asking for politeness. "It wasn't easy," I admitted. Something softened in his eyes. He didn't smile, didn't comment further. Just nodded as if he understood more than I had said. The rest of the dinner blurred. I couldn't taste the food, couldn't follow the conversations. My awareness kept drifting back to him. The quiet authority, the way people leaned in when he spoke, the way he seemed both present and absent, surrounded yet alone. When the evening ended, guests filtered out into the warm night. I lingered in the garden, half hidden in the shadows of the palms. That was when I felt it again, his gaze. He stood across the courtyard, speaking softly to an elder, but his eyes slipped toward me once, twice. Not by accident. Not hunger. Not desire. Something gentler, something harder to define. It wasn't about wanting. It was about seeing. For the first time since I had arrived in this vast, glittering foreign place, I felt a weight lift from my chest. For weeks, I had been moving like a ghost among strangers, performing my duties, smiling politely, never really belonging. But when his eyes held mine, I felt it. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't adrift. I wasn't alone. That night, lying awake in the guest wing, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A glance. A coincidence. But the memory stayed with me like heat on the skin. The way he looked at me. And though nothing had been spoken, something in me knew. This night was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. The desert has a strange way of bending time. Days move slow under the sun, but nights fall like a curtain, sudden and heavy. By the second week after that dinner, I had almost convinced myself that what passed between us was nothing more than imagination. Almost. But then came the blackout. The lights flickered in the guest wing one evening, a low hum followed by sudden stillness. The air conditioning cut out, leaving the room thick with heat. I opened the window, but the desert wind was no kindness, just warm air pressing closer. I had shed my shirt, trying to breathe in the stillness, when a knock sounded at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there he was. Sheikh. Not in his flowing robes, not with the distance of ceremony, but in a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled, his collar open. He looked different, younger almost, human in a way I wasn't prepared for. "The power has gone in this wing," he said, his voice as even as ever. Then, after a pause that felt deliberate, "Come. The terrace will have air." I hesitated, but he waited, patient. So I followed him through the dim hallways, our footsteps echoing against the silence. The terrace sat high above the courtyard, overlooking the city lights. Out there, the breeze was real, cooler, carrying the scent of sea and dust. We sat side by side on a stone bench, the city shimmering in the distance like a field of stars scattered across the earth. At first, neither of us spoke. I tried to steady my breathing, though every inhale seemed to tremble. I was too aware of him, how close he sat, how the sleeve of his shirt brushed against my bare arm when the wind pulled it loose. And then he broke the silence. "You look," he said softly, "as though you are carrying weight no one sees." The word struck me harder than I expected. I laughed awkwardly, tried to brush it off. "I suppose everyone carries something." He didn't answer. He just looked at me, the kind of look that makes pretending impossible. My throat tightened. For weeks, I had been swallowing loneliness whole, wearing composure like armor. And somehow, with one sentence, he had seen through it all. I turned my gaze back to the city lights, afraid of what might show on my face. Afraid of how much it mattered that he had noticed. The silence between us grew heavier, yet not uncomfortable. Not empty. It was the kind of silence that said more than words. And then it happened, something small, something ordinary, but everything at once. Our knees touched. It was nothing, an accident of space. We both could have shifted, pulled away. But neither of us moved. My heart thundered in my chest. My skin buzzed where his leg brushed mine. I tried to convince myself it was meaningless, but the stillness told another story. His breath slowed, deliberate. His hand, resting on the bench, flexed once, then stilled. I wondered if he could hear my pulse, if he could feel the storm unraveling inside me. Minutes passed like hours. The city stretched out below us, indifferent, endless. But all I knew was the warmth of his knee against mine, the quiet acknowledgement that neither of us would name. Too close. Too close to be nothing. When at last he rose, the moment broke like glass. He didn't look at me, didn't speak as he motioned toward the door. I followed him back down through the silent halls, my mind reeling, my body alive with something I had no words for. At my door he paused just a second too long. His eyes held mine, unreadable. And then he gave the smallest nod, as though sealing an agreement neither of us had dared to voice. That night, lying awake in the heat, I touched my knee where it had pressed against his. It was absurd, ridiculous, I told myself. Just two bodies sharing space. Just coincidence. But it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like the beginning of a language we had only just started to learn. Too close to be nothing. Too silent to be explained. And deep down I knew, this was no accident. In the days that followed, we didn't speak about that night on the terrace. Not a word. But something had shifted. It was there in the smallest moments. At breakfast, when I felt his gaze linger a fraction too long across the table. Passing through the courtyard, when his hand brushed mine by accident, or maybe not by accident, and the air seemed to hold its breath. We avoided the subject, but silence has a way of becoming louder than words. I found myself listening for him without meaning to. The sound of his footsteps on the marble, the quiet authority in his voice when he addressed others. Every time he entered a room I felt it before I saw him. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of rust as a sandstorm rolled through the city. The windows rattled and the air thickened with dust. Trapped inside, I wandered into the library, seeking refuge in its cool shadows. And there he was. Sitting alone at a long table, a book open before him, the storm's glow spilling through the high windows. For a moment I considered turning back, afraid of what being alone with him meant. But then he looked up. His expression didn't change, yet his eyes softened in a way that left me no choice but to stay. He gestured to the chair beside him. I sat. The silence pressed in around us, thickened by the storm. He closed his book, leaned back and simply watched the shifting light on the wall. He didn't fill the air with small talk, didn't ask questions. And yet, somehow, his presence invited something out of me I hadn't planned to share. Almost without realizing it, I whispered, "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong anywhere." The words shocked me the moment they left my mouth. I wasn't someone who confessed easily. Especially not here, not to him. Heat flushed my face and I braced for his judgment, or worse, his indifference. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his gaze toward me, steady, quiet. "You belong here," he said. Just 3 words. Simple. Certain. And yet they pierced through me, anchoring something I hadn't known was drifting. I tried to smile, to deflect, but my throat caught. There was no mockery in his tone, no careful politeness. He said it as though it were fact, not comfort. We didn't move closer. We didn't touch. But I felt something change in that moment, something neither of us could deny. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive, humming as if the storm outside had moved inside us, filling the space between breaths. I looked at him, then really looked. His profile caught in the dim light, the way his jaw tensed as though holding back words, the faint weariness in his eyes. He wasn't the untouchable figure people bowed to. He was human. And he was letting me see it. For the rest of the afternoon we sat there in that library saying very little. Occasionally he'd turn a page and the sound would break the quiet like a ripple in still water. The storm raged outside, dust swirling, winds howling, but inside something softer grew. When the sky finally cleared, he rose, closed his book, and gave me a look that said more than anything either of us had spoken. A look that acknowledged what now existed between us. He left first. I stayed behind, my heart still unsteady, the echo of his words running through me. You belong here. There was nothing, and everything. That night, lying awake, I realized silence wasn't empty at all. Silence was where the truth lived, waiting for us to be brave enough to hear it. And with him, I had begun to hear it. Something in the silence. Something undeniable. Something that was changing everything. It happened on a night that felt like any other. The air was cooler than usual, a soft wind weaving through the palace gardens. Lanterns glowed in the trees, scattering light across stone paths lined with roses. I had gone for a walk to clear my head, to quiet the noise inside me that seemed to grow louder with every passing day. But of course he was there. I found him standing near the fountain, the water lit faintly gold by the lanterns. His posture was relaxed in a way I had rarely seen, his hands clasped behind his back as though he were simply another man out for evening air. Not the Sheikh. Not the figure people bowed to. Just Amir. When he noticed me, his expression didn't change. No surprise, no forced greeting, just a slight nod that somehow carried more warmth than any spoken word. I hesitated, but my feet carried me toward him. We fell into step along the path, side by side, saying nothing. The garden was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the trickle of water. For a while, I let myself believe it was ordinary, two men sharing a walk in the evening air. I told myself the thrum in my chest was nothing. That the awareness of his nearness, the brush of his robe against my arm, the faint scent of oud clinging to him, was imagined. But then I stumbled. The stone path dipped unexpectedly, and I caught my foot on the uneven edge. I lurched forward, heat rushing to my face at the clumsiness. Before I could catch myself, his hand was on me. Strong fingers curled around my arm, steadying me. His grip was firm, unyielding. The kind of touch that left no room for falling. I expected him to let go the moment I regained my balance. Anyone else would have. But he didn't. For a second, longer than a second, his hand stayed. Warm. Certain. Anchoring me in place. I couldn't breathe. My body went still, my pulse loud in my ears. His eyes met mine and something passed between us, unspoken but undeniable. And then, slowly, deliberately, he let go. The absence of his touch felt louder than the touch itself. My skin burned where his hand had been, as though the memory had been branded into me. I tried to laugh, to brush it off. I should watch where I'm going. But my voice was thin, betraying me. He didn't answer. He just gave the faintest shake of his head, a gesture so small it might have been imagined. Yet the weight of it lingered, heavier than words. We continued walking, but the air had changed. Every step, every brush of our sleeves felt charged. I could no longer pretend the space between us was empty. It was full, too full, with everything we weren't saying. Later that night, back in my room, I replayed it endlessly. The way his hand had fit around my arm, the steadiness of it, the hesitation before he let go. I pressed my own palm to the spot, foolishly hoping the warmth might still be there. It was just a touch. That's what I told myself. Nothing more. But the truth was, it wasn't just. Because when someone touches you and it lingers long after, it stops being ordinary. It becomes a confession. Even if neither of you dares to speak it aloud. The next day we moved as though nothing had happened. At breakfast he spoke to others, his voice calm, his expression unreadable. I answered questions from his cousins, smiled when expected. We performed our roles flawlessly. But beneath it all, that touch lived. And I knew he knew too. Nothing between us had been spoken, yet everything had been said. The touch had stayed. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pretend it away. I lasted 2 days pretending it was nothing. 2 days of sitting across the breakfast table, acting as though his hand had never lingered on my arm. 2 days of walking through the courtyard, hearing his voice in passing and pretending it didn't pull at me like a tide. But silence has its limits. It was the third night when I found myself on the terrace again. The air was heavy with the smell of jasmine, the city below glowing like scattered embers. I hadn't expected him to be there, but of course he was. He stood by the railing, hands resting on the stone, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't turn when I stepped into the light. He just said softly, "You couldn't sleep either." Something in his tone disarmed me. Not a question. A recognition. I joined him at the railing, leaving a careful distance between us. For a while we simply stood there, breathing the same night air, watching the city blink. My heart raced, and yet there was calm in it too, like my body knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. It slipped out before I could stop it. "It doesn't feel like nothing." The words startled me even as I said them. My throat tightened, my palms damp. I wanted to take them back, to laugh, to bury the truth before it ruined everything. The silence that followed was unbearable. I kept my eyes fixed on the city, too afraid to see his reaction. But then, in a voice lower than I'd ever heard, he whispered, "No. It doesn't." My chest collapsed with relief and terror all at once. I turned to look at him, and for the first time his composure cracked. Just slightly. His jaw tightened, his hand gripped the railing as though steadying himself. We didn't move closer. Not yet. But the air between us was no longer empty. It was alive, pulsing, undeniable. I swallowed hard, my voice trembling. "Then what is it?" He shook his head faintly, a soft, almost broken smile tugging at his lips. "Something I cannot name." For a moment, neither of us breathed. The city stretched endless before us, but it felt like the whole world had narrowed to this terrace, this silence, this impossible truth we had finally dared to touch. And then, slowly, carefully, he shifted closer. His shoulder brushed mine, and this time I didn't move. The warmth of him seeped through me, steadying, terrifying, perfect. We stayed like that, leaning into the quiet, until at last he turned, just enough that our foreheads met. The touch was feather-light, no more than a breath, but it broke me open. My eyes closed, and for a second, everything else fell away, the city, the rules, the fear. All that remained was the fragile truth of his skin against mine. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. That touch carried everything. When he finally drew back, his eyes held mine, steady but vulnerable. "If this is real," his voice faltered, then steadied, "then everything changes." My throat ached. I wanted to answer, but no words came. Instead, I let my hand rest on the railing, close enough that my fingers brushed his. He didn't pull away. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever this was, whatever name we dared or didn't dare give it, it wasn't nothing. It never had been. After that night on the terrace, nothing was said, and yet nothing was the same. We didn't confess. We didn't label it. But the air between us had changed forever. It showed in the little ways. In the mornings, when he passed me in the courtyard, his eyes lingered a second too long. In the afternoons, he found reasons to draw me into quiet corners, asking about books, about my family, about nothing at all. At dinner, his voice grew softer when he spoke to me, even if others didn't notice. It was all small, fragile, hidden in plain sight. But for me, it was everything. One evening, he invited me to walk the gardens again. Lanterns glowed in the branches, casting their soft light on the stone paths. We walked slowly, as though stretching every second. He asked about my home, about the rain in England, about what I missed most. "My mother's garden," I said, surprising myself with the tenderness in my voice. It was small, but she grew roses. The smell of them, it always felt safe. He listened, not with the polite attention most people give, but with the kind of presence that makes you feel every word matters. "Then these must comfort you," he said, gesturing to the roses lining the path. "They do," I admitted, smiling faintly. "But not as much as—" I stopped, realizing what I had almost said. "Not as much as you." The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was charged, warm, alive. We sat on a low stone wall by the fountain, the night air cool on our skin. For a while we didn't speak, and then he laughed. It startled me. A real laugh, low and unguarded, spilling out of him before he could catch it. I don't even remember what I had said to cause it. But the sound filled me in a way I hadn't known I was starving for. I stared at him, caught off guard by the sheer beauty of it. Not the beauty of his face, though that was undeniable, but of his freedom in that moment. The way he let himself forget the weight he carried. And before I could think, before I could second guess, I leaned my head against his shoulder. I froze immediately, my chest pounding. But he didn't move. He didn't pull away. He didn't tense. He just stayed. His shoulder was solid beneath me, his warmth steady, his breath deep and even. My eyes closed without permission, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt still. Safe. We didn't speak. We didn't move. The fountain trickled, the wind rustled through the roses, the lanterns swayed above us. And in that silence I realized the truth. I had been waiting for this without even knowing it. Not waiting for him specifically, not then. But waiting for this feeling. This closeness. This quiet certainty that I wasn't alone, that someone else carried me without asking, without condition. He shifted slightly, not away but closer. His arm brushed mine, firm and deliberate, as if to say, I'm here. Time blurred. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Minutes. Hours. Maybe an eternity tucked into a single night. When we finally moved, it wasn't with reluctance. It was with care, as though breaking a spell too precious to shatter. We walked back in silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that begged to be filled. It was complete. Oh. At my door he paused. His eyes held mine, steady and unreadable, and yet I felt the question there, the same one that had been echoing inside me all along. What if this is real? I didn't answer it, not with words. I just let my hand brush his lightly as I stepped inside. And he let it stay. That night I didn't dream. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in my life I wasn't waiting anymore. I had already found what I didn't know I'd been searching for. Morning came gently. The first rays of sunlight spilled across the marble floors, pale and golden, painting the courtyard in quiet light. Birds stirred in the palms, and somewhere in the distance, the call to prayer rose like a breath across the waking city. I hadn't slept much. My body was still humming from the night before, from the weight of my head on his shoulder, from the closeness we had finally allowed. Every time I closed my eyes I felt it again, that stillness, that certainty. When I stepped into the garden he was already there. Amir stood near the fountain, his hands clasped behind his back, his robe catching the morning light. He looked as he always did, calm, composed, steady. And yet, when his eyes found mine, I saw it. The same shift I felt inside me. Something irreversibly changed. Walk with me, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. We moved through the garden paths, the dew catching on roses, the air cool before the desert heat would rise. Neither of us spoke at first. We didn't need to. Our steps fell into rhythm, our silence shared. At one point he reached for my hand. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even deliberate, at least not in the way gestures are usually deliberate. His hand simply found mine and then stayed. Warm. Solid. Unshakable. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. He didn't look at me when he did it. He just kept walking, eyes fixed ahead, as though this was the most natural thing in the world. And in that moment I realized, maybe it was. Maybe this, whatever we were, whatever we would become, wasn't about grand declarations or impossible promises. Maybe it was about this quiet presence. This knowing. We stopped near the far edge of the garden, where the fountain spray caught the light like glass. He finally turned to me, his eyes steady. I don't know what this will be, he said softly. I cannot promise what I cannot control. The words should have stung. Should have filled me with fear. But they didn't. Because there was something else beneath them, something true, something raw. But, he continued, his voice almost breaking, I know I don't regret it. I felt my throat tighten. My eyes burned. I wanted to speak, but all that came out was a whisper, neither do I. We stood there in silence, hand in hand, as the morning swelled around us. The world carried on, the city waking, the calls echoing, the servants beginning their routines, but in that moment, it felt distant. Unreal. All that was real was this. His hand in mine, the steadiness of his gaze, the quiet promise that no matter what happened next, this, we, was true. He lifted my hand then, just slightly, almost absent-mindedly, and let his thumb trace the back of it. Such a small thing, but it unraveled me. It said more than any vow ever could. I thought of the first time I saw him, how he had passed by, how his eyes had met mine and without a word, made me feel I wasn't alone. I hadn't understood it then. But I did now. It had never been about chance. It had been about recognition. Two lives, two silences, finding each other in a world that didn't expect it. We walked back slowly, neither of us letting go. At the courtyard steps he finally released my hand. Duty was waiting. Appearances. Expectations. He had to step back into the role that defined him, the world that claimed him. But before he did, he gave me a look, one that carried everything we couldn't say. It wasn't a promise of forever. It wasn't certainty. It was something quieter but no less powerful. Whatever this becomes, I want it. I nodded, the words catching in my throat. As I turned to go, I realized something I hadn't before. I didn't need to know what the future held. I didn't need names or definitions or guarantees. Because in the softest, most fragile of ways, I had already found what I hadn't even known I was searching for. And I knew without doubt that I wouldn't undo it for anything. The Sheikh had passed by me once, and in that single look, he had made me feel I was not alone. Now, standing in the rising light of morning, I knew I never truly would be again. Whatever this becomes, it is real. And it is enough.